Dr. Richard Haversham sat at his desk, scribbling equations on a chalkboard in front of the lecture hall. He was known for his sharp mind and sharp tongue, but most of all he was known for his disdain toward anyone who didn't fit his idea of a serious student. He often joked with his students that, if you don't understand calculus, maybe you should try a career in something simpler, like acting. The lecture hall was filled with students who had all been working hard to understand the complicated math. But to Dr. Haversham it was all so easy, so obvious. As he spoke, a student entered the classroom. The door opened softly and the figure stepped inside. He wasn't dressed in a typical college student's clothes. Instead, he wore a plain shirt and a jacket, looking almost out of place among the students in jeans and hoodies. His hair was a bit disheveled, but there was something about him that seemed oddly familiar. He didn't look nervous, just calm and collected. It was only when he turned slightly to face the students that Dr. Haversham recognized him, though he quickly dismissed the thought. "Great," Dr. Haversham muttered to himself, "another student late to my class." But what struck him as odd was how quiet and composed the newcomer was. Most students were either rushing to find a seat or trying to make excuses for their tardiness. This one just stood still, scanning the room as if he didn't have a care in the world. Without missing a beat, Dr. Haversham continued his lecture. Calculus is the language of the universe. It is the foundation of all mathematics, the tool that allows us to understand everything from physics to engineering to economics. The professor's voice was firm, almost condescending as he turned to write more equations on the board. The student walked slowly toward the back of the room, moving without any hurry, and sat down in the last row. Dr. Haversham glanced at him briefly. The man had a calm demeanor about him, but there was something in his eyes that made Dr. Haversham suspicious. He didn't look like the type of person who would be serious about mathematics. Dr. Haversham had met plenty of students who only took his classes because they thought it would help their careers. But this student, he didn't fit the profile. And then it clicked in his mind. Wasn't he? Dr. Haversham paused for just a moment, trying to place the face. It seemed familiar, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. The class was already behind, and he didn't have patience for distractions. The student was still sitting quietly, and as the lecture went on, Dr. Haversham couldn't help but feel a bit of irritation. The guy seemed out of place, as if he didn't belong. Maybe he's one of those celebrities who think they can just show up and get a degree for the sake of it, Dr. Haversham thought. He'd seen it before, actors, athletes, even musicians, all thinking that taking a course in higher education would somehow make them seem more intellectual in the public eye. It was all so transparent, so Dr. Haversham decided to throw in a little jab. He did it casually, like he always did with students who seemed too comfortable in his class. He paused, turned around, and addressed the whole class. "Now, as we dive into derivatives and integrals, let's remember that math isn't magic. You can't just solve equations by waving a wand, like some of you might be used to doing in your careers." He glanced in the direction of the newcomer at the back of the room, just to make sure he caught the implied insult. The students in the room laughed, as they often did when Dr. Haversham made one of his sarcastic comments. But the new student didn't laugh. He didn't even flinch. He just sat there, his expression unreadable. Dr. Haversham thought nothing more of it. He went back to his lecture, going into detail about limits and functions, assuming the celebrity student in the back would drift off into daydreams like many others who weren't really interested in the subject. As the lecture came to an end, the student stood up and quietly gathered his things. Dr. Haversham didn't even look at him as he passed. There was no need to. After all, why would an actor be interested in a subject like calculus? It wasn't until after class that Dr. Haversham was still pondering the student's strange presence. The man was just too quiet, too reserved, and it was starting to bother him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But he quickly pushed the thought away. After all, he was a professor. His job was to teach, not to worry about the personal lives of his students. And as far as he was concerned, anyone who didn't take his subject seriously wasn't worth his time. The next day, the student appeared again. This time, though, he walked up to Dr. Haversham's desk after the lecture. Dr. Haversham didn't know what to expect, but he was sure the man was going to ask for an easier path through the class or complain about the difficulty of the material. "Excuse me, Professor Haversham." The voice was calm, smooth, and oddly familiar. Dr. Havisham looked up from his papers, suddenly realizing that the man was standing right in front of him. "Yes?" Dr. Havisham replied, trying to hide his irritation. "I wanted to talk to you about the course," the student said. Dr. Havisham raised an eyebrow. "Yes, what about it? Having trouble with the material? I'm happy to help, but I don't recommend taking this subject lightly. It's not for the faint of heart." The student nodded slowly as if he was processing what was being said. "Actually, I'm here because I wanted to take the class seriously. I've been reading a lot on my own, and I'm hoping you can help me expand my understanding of the subject." Dr. Havisham wasn't sure if he should be amused or annoyed. "Reading on your own, huh? That's interesting. What exactly have you been reading?" The student smiled a little, almost shyly. "I've been reading on number theory, calculus, and even some of the more abstract concepts in mathematics. I've always had an interest in the subject." Dr. Havisham leaned back in his chair, a bit taken aback. Most students came to him for help because they couldn't understand the basics. But this one was different. "You've been reading number theory? And abstract concepts, you?" Dr. Havisham asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The student nodded. "Yes, I'm really passionate about it. But I don't want to cause any trouble. I just want to learn." For a moment, Dr. Havisham stood there, not sure what to say. The man's calmness was disarming, and for a brief second he couldn't help but wonder if he'd judged him too quickly. But he quickly dismissed that thought. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "if you want to learn, you'll need to catch up. We're already covering some very complex material. I hope you're up for it." The student nodded again. "I'm ready." Dr. Havisham studied him for a moment, trying to figure out what kind of game he was playing. But the student didn't seem like someone trying to prove anything. There was no arrogance in his tone, no need to show off. He simply wanted to learn. Dr. Havisham finally gave a small nod. "All right, well, we'll see how things go. But if you think you can just stroll in here and learn calculus without putting in the work, you're in for a rude awakening." He gave the student one last glance before turning back to his papers, ready to leave for the day. The student simply smiled and walked out of the room, leaving Dr. Havisham to ponder the strange encounter. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this student than met the eye. The next few weeks were a blur of lectures, assignments, and exams. Dr. Havisham's calculus class was never an easy ride for students, but it was always interesting to see who could keep up with the pace. As he continued teaching, he noticed the student in the back of the room more and more. The man, whose name Dr. Havisham still hadn't caught, didn't miss a class. In fact, he seemed to always be the first one to arrive, sitting quietly, waiting for the lecture to begin. He took notes, asked occasional questions, and participated when needed. But there was something unsettling about him. He was too quiet, too focused. One day, as Dr. Havisham was walking to his office, he overheard some students talking about the actor who was attending his class. "Can you believe it?" one of them said. "That guy from all those movies is in our calculus class." Another student added, "Yeah, I heard he's not just here for the attention. He actually knows math." Weird, right? Dr. Havisham's ears perked up. Wait a second, he thought to himself. That student is an actor? He had assumed that the man's face was familiar, because he was just another celebrity trying to get into a prestigious university. But now, hearing the students talk about him, it hit Dr. Havisham that the student in question wasn't just any actor. This man was famous. He had seen him in movies. But Dr. Havisham was still skeptical. He thought to himself, actors aren't exactly known for their intellectual depth. The next day after class, Dr. Havisham decided to ask the student himself. He waited until the classroom started clearing out, and then approached the man who had been sitting quietly at the back. The student was packing his things slowly, like he didn't have anywhere to rush off to. "Excuse me," Dr. Havisham began, trying to sound casual. "I overheard some students talking. They mentioned that you're, an actor?" The student looked up, surprised but not offended. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm and even. "I do act, but I'm here because I've always had an interest in math. I'm not just here to show up for the sake of it." Dr. Havisham nodded slowly, trying to process the information. "Right, of course. I just didn't expect to see someone with your profile in my class. Usually people come here because they're serious about learning. No offense, but actors tend to, focus on their careers. His tone was more judgmental than he intended, but he couldn't help it. He still wasn't convinced that this person was as serious about mathematics as he claimed. The student smiled, his expression warm but without arrogance. I understand, I get it. But I assure you I've been reading a lot on my own and trying to understand things on a deeper level. I want to challenge myself. Dr. Haversham was taken aback. Reading a lot on his own? That didn't sound like the usual celebrity. In fact, Dr. Haversham had to admit that the man didn't seem like the type of person who would just show up to get attention or to coast through an easy class. But still, Dr. Haversham couldn't shake his own skepticism. It was hard for him to believe that someone who spent their days acting could also be serious about something as complicated as calculus. Well, Dr. Haversham said, trying to sound less dismissive, if you want to do well in this class, you'll need to keep up with the material. It's not easy. And I don't give any special treatment to anyone, no matter who they are. The student nodded without hesitation. I understand. I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want to learn. Good, Dr. Haversham replied, feeling a little bit better about the whole situation. We'll see how you do. Just keep in mind this isn't a class where you can simply show up and expect to get by. You'll have to work for it. I'm ready, the student said, packing up the last of his things and standing up. Thank you for your time, Professor. Dr. Haversham watched him leave, still unsure what to think. But as the days passed, he noticed something. The student was always there, and when the professor talked about complex concepts like integrals and series, the student didn't seem confused. In fact, he seemed completely at ease with the material. More than that, he often asked insightful questions that made Dr. Haversham stop and think. These weren't the kinds of questions a casual student would ask. No, this student was genuinely interested. One day, as Dr. Haversham was walking to his office, he saw the student sitting outside reading a book. He wasn't reading some casual fiction novel. Instead, he was reading Advanced Calculus, a comprehensive guide by a well-known mathematician. Dr. Haversham couldn't believe his eyes. The student was reading a textbook on advanced calculus outside of class. Dr. Haversham walked over, unable to help himself. You're really reading that? He asked, trying to sound casual but genuinely curious. The student looked up and smiled as if he was expecting the question. Yes, he said simply. I've been studying it on my own. I've always liked math, but I've never had the time to really dive into it until now. Dr. Haversham stood there for a moment, just staring at the student. It was hard to process what he was hearing. How could this be? He had assumed this actor was just in the class because he wanted something to look good in interviews or press releases. But here was a man who was putting in the same kind of effort as any of his top students. What's going on here? Dr. Haversham thought. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the feeling that he was in over his head. Well, I must admit I'm surprised. I didn't expect someone with your background to be so committed, the student smiled, nodding slightly. I guess people have different sides to them. Dr. Haversham wasn't sure how to respond. For the first time in his career, he was starting to doubt himself. He had always been confident in his ability to spot talent, to separate those who were serious from those who were just looking to coast. But now in front of him was someone who defied every expectation he had. Still, Dr. Haversham had a job to do. He couldn't let his surprise get in the way of teaching. But there was something else too, a growing sense of curiosity. He wanted to know more about this student. More than that, he wanted to see if the student could actually keep up with the rest of the class, the way he seemed to be doing. Days passed, and the class went on. The student continued to perform well. In fact, he was often the first to answer the toughest questions Dr. Haversham posed. His answers were precise and thoughtful, and though Dr. Haversham tried to challenge him in every possible way, the student never seemed rattled. It was starting to annoy Dr. Haversham. No one had ever made him feel like this in a long time. It was as if this student was quietly surpassing all expectations, and Dr. Haversham couldn't figure out how. What was this guy really capable of? One day, during a particularly challenging lecture on the Riemann hypothesis, Dr. Haversham decided to test the student. He asked a question that he knew would stump most of the class. Can anyone explain why the Riemann hypothesis is so important to the distribution of prime numbers? The student, who had been quietly following along, raised his hand. Dr. Haversham couldn't help but feel a flash of annoyance. Here we go again, he thought. But he called on the student anyway, yes? Dr. Haversham asked, his voice cool and professional. The student stood up, his face calm as always, and began explaining the Riemann hypothesis in detail, step by step, showing a level of understanding that most students could only dream of. His explanation was clear, concise, and deeply insightful. He didn't just talk about the hypothesis itself, but also its implications on number theory, prime number distribution, and its connections to other areas of mathematics. By the time the student finished, the entire class was silent. Dr. Haversham stood there, mouth slightly open, feeling a mix of shock and admiration. How had this man learned all of this on his own, he wondered, and why had he never mentioned it before? It was clear now. This wasn't just any student. This wasn't just an actor trying to get a degree. This was someone who was genuinely passionate about mathematics, someone who understood the beauty and complexity of the subject in a way that few could. And for the first time, Dr. Haversham realized that he had misjudged him, but the question still lingered in Dr. Haversham's mind. Who was this person really? The days went by quickly after that lecture. Dr. Haversham's feelings about his student were in turmoil. On the one hand, he couldn't ignore the man's clear talent, his deep understanding of mathematics. On the other hand, it frustrated him that he had underestimated him for so long. The student had shown him up in front of the entire class, and though he was impressed, part of him still didn't want to admit it. For the first time in years, Dr. Haversham found himself thinking more about one student than he ever had about any other. He couldn't understand how someone who seemed so out of place in a university setting could be so advanced in math. It was hard for him to imagine that someone with such a public profile could also be genuinely gifted in something as complex as calculus. In the next few classes, Dr. Haversham tried to throw more challenges in front of the students, especially the ones sitting at the back. He made the problems more complicated, asked more questions that required real insight, but every time the student had an answer. Every single time. It was as if nothing could faze him. The other students began to notice too. They were confused. After all, if the man sitting in the back of the class was an actor, why was he so good at this? But it was only a matter of time before one of the students asked the question that everyone else was too afraid to. "Hey, you're the guy from those movies, right?" one of them asked, looking at the student from across the room during a break. "I mean, you look so familiar. Are you really in this class to learn math?" The student smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that someone gives when they're embarrassed or surprised. It was more like a knowing smile, the kind someone might give when they've heard the question 1,000 times before. "Yes, I am," he said quietly. "But that's not the only thing I'm here for." The student didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving the other students in stunned silence. That wasn't a typical response from anyone, let alone someone who was constantly in the spotlight. The rest of the class, now even more curious, began to whisper amongst themselves. The word spread quickly. "He's a math genius," they said. No one knew, but he really knows his stuff. Dr. Haversham, though, didn't pay much attention to the whispers. He was too focused on the upcoming midterm exam. It was always the toughest exam of the semester, a test designed to push the students to their limits. He spent long hours preparing the questions, making sure that no one could cheat their way through. There was no room for shortcuts in his class. When the exam finally came, the room was filled with a tense energy. Students flipped through their test papers, their brows furrowed in concentration. Dr. Haversham walked up and down the rows, watching for anyone who might be struggling. As usual, most of the students were visibly overwhelmed by the complexity of the questions. But there, sitting at the back of the room, was the student, the actor, working through the problems with the same calm demeanor he always had. His pencil moved swiftly across the paper, scribbling down answers with a confidence that most of the others lacked. Dr. Haversham couldn't help himself. He kept glancing at him, trying to catch a glimpse of his work. But the student was focused, his face a mask of concentration. The professor knew that this midterm would be the perfect test. After all, it was the hardest exam of the year, and it would reveal if this man really was a math genius or if he was just getting by on luck. After an hour, Dr. Haversham noticed something strange. The student was the first to finish. He stood up, gathered his papers, and quietly left the room without so much as a word. The other students were still hunched over their papers, scribbling out answers or erasing mistakes. They barely noticed the student leaving. Dr. Haversham felt a wave of irritation rise up in him. How could he finish so quickly, he thought. No one can finish the midterm in less than an hour. This is supposed to be difficult, not something you breeze through. But instead of confronting the student, Dr. Haversham simply turned back to the rest of the class. His mind was still spinning. By the end of the day, the papers were all graded and the results were posted. It was no surprise that the student had aced the exam. In fact, he had scored higher than anyone else, including the students who were usually the top performers. His performance on the Riemann hypothesis question was flawless, better than anyone in the class, including Dr. Haversham himself. But what shocked Dr. Haversham more than the grade was the student's response. After the exam, when the results were announced, the actor came up to Dr. Haversham's office. The professor wasn't expecting it, but the student stood there with a quiet smile. "Professor," he began, "I wanted to thank you for this opportunity. I know I may not be what you expected, but I wanted you to know that I'm really grateful for the chance to take this class seriously." Dr. Haversham was taken aback. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, confused by the student's words. The student explained, "I didn't take this class just because I wanted to be in college. I've always had a passion for mathematics. It started when I was younger, just messing around with numbers. I didn't get a chance to pursue it then, but now that I can, I'm giving it everything I've got." For the first time, Dr. Haversham saw the student in a different light. The pieces were starting to fall into place. It wasn't just about being good at math. This wasn't some actor looking to add another feather to his cap. No, this was someone who had a real love for the subject, someone who had spent years developing a deep understanding of the material on his own. And what made it even more remarkable was that he had done it without any formal training. "I see," Dr. Haversham said slowly, his mind racing. "And, why didn't you say anything earlier? Why all the secrecy?" The student smiled. "It's not about secrecy," he said, almost as if he were explaining it to a child. "I just didn't want to make it about me. I wanted to prove myself based on what I could do, not what I've done in another world." For the first time in a long while, Dr. Haversham felt a sense of respect for a student that wasn't just based on intellectual ability. It was a respect for the quiet, determined way the student had gone about his studies. The actor hadn't needed to flaunt his abilities. He didn't need to announce that he was a genius. He simply did the work, day in and day out. "I have to admit," Dr. Haversham said, looking at the student with a new sense of humility, "I didn't expect this, but you've shown me something. You've shown me that anyone can surprise you, and sometimes the people you least expect to be exceptional are the ones who teach you the most." The student's smile widened. "I'm just glad I got the chance to learn from you." Dr. Haversham nodded, his pride slowly giving way to a newfound respect. "You've earned it. I'll see you in the next class, and don't worry about your grade. You've made it clear that you understand the material." The student gave a grateful nod before turning to leave. As he walked out of the office, Dr. Haversham stood there for a long moment, deep in thought. He had been humbled, and it felt strange, but good. For the first time in years, he realized that no matter how much knowledge he still had something to learn. And as the days passed, Dr. Haversham found himself looking at his class in a new way. It wasn't just about the equations on the board. It was about the people in the room. Everyone had a story, and everyone had something to offer, if you were willing to look beyond the surface. The semester passed quickly after the midterm. Dr. Haversham couldn't deny that he was learning as much from his students as they were from him. But there was still something special about the student who had started all of this, about the actor who turned out to be a math genius. For the next few weeks, things seemed normal again. The student continued attending class, answering questions with calm precision. Dr. Haversham, despite himself, began to look forward to their interactions. He was no longer as skeptical of the student. In fact, he started to admire his quiet determination. He would often catch himself wondering how much more this student could accomplish, if only he applied himself fully to mathematics. There were still whispers among the other students, though. They would occasionally glance at the actor-turned-mathematician in awe, Some even started asking him for help on assignments, though he always turned them down with a polite, "I think it's best if you work through it on your own." His response was often met with confusion. After all, in most university settings, anyone as talented as he was would be praised for helping others. But not him. He never sought attention, never boasted. One day, as Dr. Haversham was wrapping up a particularly difficult lecture on differential equations, he noticed something strange. The student had stayed after class again, which wasn't unusual, but this time he was sitting alone in the corner, his head buried in a pile of books. Dr. Haversham had a rare free moment and decided to check in with him. "Is everything all right?" he asked, walking over to where the student sat. The student looked up, a little surprised. "Oh yeah, I'm just trying to work through some advanced problems. I've been thinking about how calculus connects to real-world physics. There's a lot I still want to understand." Dr. Haversham raised an eyebrow. "Advanced problems, huh? You're not letting up, are you?" The student gave a small laugh. "I guess not. I've always wanted to dive deeper into how math fits into the universe. It's like the more I learn, the more I realize how much more there is to explore." Dr. Haversham couldn't help but be impressed. "I've never known someone to take math this seriously outside of the classroom. You're pushing yourself harder than any student I've had in years." The student smiled, but there was a certain weariness in his eyes. "It's not always easy. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in all the material, but I know it's worth it." That was the first time Dr. Haversham saw the burden of it all on the student's face. This wasn't just a passion for math. It was something deeper, something more personal. The pressure he felt to constantly prove himself, to keep up with the relentless pace he had set for himself, was starting to show. "You're doing fine," Dr. Haversham said, his voice softer than usual. "But remember, it's okay to take a break. No one can keep up that kind of intensity without burning out." The student nodded, but there was a hint of frustration in his expression. "I don't know if I can. I've spent so long trying to get to this point. I can't afford to slow down now." Dr. Haversham studied him for a moment, sensing that there was more to his words than just the usual student stress. "If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me," he said before walking away. He didn't want to pry too much, but something about the student's tone lingered in his mind. The next few days, Dr. Haversham couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the student's hard work, it was his attitude toward it. He seemed so determined to push himself, almost to the point of exhaustion. Dr. Haversham couldn't help but think that this kind of drive was dangerous. One afternoon, after class, he decided to approach the student again. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day," he began, sitting down next to him. "I know you're passionate about math, but I want to make sure you're not overworking yourself." The student paused, then looked up as if considering the professor's words carefully. "It's just, I feel like I have to keep going. Like I have to prove something." "Prove what?" Dr. Haversham asked gently. The student hesitated, then finally spoke. "I've spent most of my life in a different world. One where people see me for who I am, not what I know. I didn't have a chance to show this side of me before, but now that I have the chance, I don't want to waste it. I can't afford to waste it." Dr. Haversham listened carefully, his mind racing. "I understand," he said slowly, "but proving something to others isn't the same as proving it to yourself. And if you push too hard, you might end up losing sight of why you started in the first place." The student nodded, but it was clear that he wasn't ready to slow down. He appreciated Dr. Haversham's advice, but there was a wall up around him, one that the professor couldn't quite breach. In the following weeks, Dr. Haversham watched as the student continued to excel in class. His understanding of the material deepened and his answers became more sophisticated. But there was a change in him. The student had always been quiet, but now he seemed more withdrawn, more distant. The joy he once seemed to find in learning was slowly being replaced by the weight of his own expectations. It was as if the passion that had driven him was beginning to take its toll. One afternoon, Dr. Haversham noticed something else. The student wasn't in class. It wasn't like him to miss a lecture, especially one as important as the one they were having that day. Dr. Haversham waited for the student to show up, but he never did. By the time class ended, the professor found himself with a feeling of unease. That evening, he decided to check on him. He knew it was a bit unusual, but something told him that he needed to reach out. He sent an email hoping for a quick reply. "Are you feeling all right? We missed you in class today. Let me know if you need anything." The next morning, the student responded. The message was short. "Sorry, I had to take some time to think. I'll be back in class soon. Don't worry about me." But Dr. Haversham didn't stop worrying. There was something more going on, something that the student wasn't saying. It was clear that he was struggling with something, maybe with his sense of identity or his overwhelming desire to prove his worth. Whatever it was, Dr. Haversham knew that the student needed more than just a math class. He needed someone to help him navigate the pressure he had put on himself. A few days later, the student returned to class, but he seemed different. He was still brilliant, still answering questions with confidence, but there was an air of exhaustion about him. His eyes were heavy and his posture slumped. It was as if the weight of everything he had been carrying was starting to catch up with him. After class, Dr. Haversham decided that he couldn't just let this go. He waited for the student to pack up and approach him once again. "Hey," Dr. Haversham began, his voice kind but firm. "I know you're going through something, and I want you to know that you don't have to carry it all on your own. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." The student stopped, his expression unreadable, but after a long pause, he nodded. "I know, thanks. I just don't know how to stop." Dr. Haversham didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. The student was stronger than he realized, and no matter how much pressure he put on himself, he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. As the semester drew to a close, the student's transformation became more apparent. He didn't stop being passionate about math, far from it, but he began to understand that it was okay to take breaks, to ask for help, and to let go of the need to always be perfect. He had learned that there was no shame in being vulnerable, in acknowledging that sometimes you didn't have to do it all alone. Dr. Haversham watched him from afar, proud of the progress he had made. The student had become more than just someone who excelled in the classroom. He had become someone who understood the deeper lesson, that real growth doesn't just happen in the mind but in the heart as well. The end of the semester was fast approaching. The final exams were only a week away, and as usual, Dr. Haversham was feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He had already graded the assignments and quizzes, and for the most part, his students were performing well. But there was one student who had changed the most over the course of the semester, the one who had surprised everyone with his hidden talent for mathematics. The student had become something of a quiet figure in class, but his brilliance couldn't be ignored. He had stopped pushing himself to extremes, and Dr. Haversham saw him growing in ways that went beyond his academic performance. He had found balance, a healthy way of approaching his studies, and a way to reconcile his past with his present. There was still a sense of intensity in him, but it was no longer all-consuming. He had begun to open up just a little about his struggles, and Dr. Haversham admired his courage. One afternoon, after class, the student stayed behind again. This time it wasn't to work on advanced problems or to solve complex theories. He simply sat quietly at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him. It wasn't like the student to be so still, and Dr. Haversham noticed. He waited for a moment before walking over. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. The student looked up, a slight smile on his face. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." "About what?" Dr. Haversham asked, pulling up a chair next to him. The student hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about where I'm going with all of this. I've spent so much of my life in one world, and now I'm in another, trying to fit into something that's always felt a little foreign." Dr. Haversham nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "It's not easy to balance two worlds," he said softly. "But you're doing it, and you're doing it well." The student sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I don't know if I am. I feel like I'm always on the edge, like if I stop, I'll lose everything I've worked for, maybe even lose myself." The weight of those words hit Dr. Haversham harder than he expected. He'd seen students burn out before, but this felt different. The student wasn't just struggling with math or grades. He was struggling with his identity, with the person he had been and the person he was becoming. It was a deeper conflict, one that couldn't be solved with more equations or more study. "I think," Dr. Haversham began, choosing his words carefully, "that sometimes The most important thing you can do is not solve every problem. It's to take a step back and just breathe, to remind yourself that you don't have to carry the weight of the world alone. The student looked at him for a long moment, his gaze intense. Then he nodded slowly. I think I've been trying to be someone I'm not. Trying to prove things to people who don't even see me. Maybe it's time to stop doing that. Dr. Haversham smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. That's a big realization. And a good one. They sat there in silence for a few minutes, both of them thinking. Eventually, the student gathered his things, stood up, and turned to leave. But before he could walk out of the door, he stopped and looked back at Dr. Haversham. Thank you, he said quietly, almost as if it was an afterthought. For everything. For being patient with me. For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Dr. Haversham's heart swelled with pride. You've done all the hard work. You've earned it. As the student left the room, Dr. Haversham sat back in his chair, reflecting on how far the student had come. There had been a time when he was just another actor, another person in the public eye trying to escape into the world of academia. But now he was so much more than that. He was someone who had faced his inner struggles, acknowledged his weaknesses, and come out stronger for it. The final exam came and went, and when the grades were posted, it was no surprise that the student had done exceptionally well. He had mastered the material, but more importantly, he had learned something about himself. He had learned that math wasn't just a way to prove his worth to the world. It was a way to explore his own mind, to challenge himself and to grow, not just academically, but as a person. A few days before graduation, Dr. Haversham saw the student walking across campus, a smile on his face. He looked more at ease than he had all semester. It was the kind of smile that told Dr. Haversham everything he needed to know. The student had found his way. Hey, Dr. Haversham called out as the student passed by. The student stopped and turned around, his face lighting up when he saw the professor. Hey, Dr. Haversham, he said with a grin. Heading to graduation? Dr. Haversham asked, his tone light but proud. The student nodded. Yeah, it's weird. I didn't expect to make it this far, but I did. And I'm glad I did. I've learned so much, not just about math, but about myself. I'm glad to hear that, Dr. Haversham replied. It's been a pleasure having you in class. The student smiled, his eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, Professor. You helped me more than you know. Dr. Haversham nodded, watching the student walk away toward his future. He had always believed that teaching was about more than just the subject matter. It was about helping students become the best version of themselves, even if they didn't realize it at first. That was the true reward of teaching. Not the grades, not the accolades, but the knowledge that you had helped someone discover who they were meant to be. The student went on to graduate with honors, his name no longer just associated with the bright lights of Hollywood, but with a newfound passion for mathematics. He didn't abandon his acting career, but he began to pursue math more seriously, taking on research projects and even teaching a few introductory courses at a local community college. The worlds he had once kept separate began to merge, creating a unique path for him, one that combined his love of mathematics with his love of storytelling. Dr. Haversham kept in touch with him over the years, following his progress and feeling a quiet sense of pride in his accomplishments. It wasn't just because the student had excelled in his class. It was because he had learned to navigate the complex world of his own heart and mind, to find a balance between the person he was and the person he wanted to become. It was the kind of journey that didn't have a clear end, and that was okay. Because sometimes the most important discoveries aren't the ones we find in textbooks, but the ones we make about ourselves along the way.